Prison, Mein Kampf, and Rebuilding. 1924. 1929. Adolf Hitler's arrest in 1923 could easily have been the end of his political journey. The charge of treason carried a potential life sentence or even execution. Yet, in a twist of fate, Hitler found that his trial and imprisonment became a stage from which to broadcast his ideas to a much wider audience and a period of relative calm during which he refined his vision. In early 1924, Hitler was put on trial before a special court in Munich. Rather than deny his actions, he boldly turned the proceedings into political theater. Dressed in a neat suit, he delivered speeches to the courtroom claiming responsibility for the attempted revolution and justifying it as an act of patriotic duty. He thundered against the traitors in Berlin who had signed the Versailles Treaty and declared that history would one day judge him and his comrades as heroes, not criminals. The judges, conservative Bavarian gentlemen not unsympathetic to nationalist rhetoric, gave Hitler remarkable leeway to speak. Reporters printed his words in newspapers, spreading his message far beyond Bavaria. By the end of the trial, Hitler had effectively won over the court of public opinion on the right. In April 1924, the court rendered its verdict. Hitler was convicted of high treason, but in consideration of what the judge called his pure patriotic motives, he was sentenced to a relatively light punishment, 5 years in prison with the possibility of early parole. In the end, he would serve only a fraction of that time. Hitler was sent to Landsberg prison, a fortress-like facility in Bavaria. To his surprise, he was not treated as a common criminal. The prison authorities, perhaps sharing some of his nationalist leanings, extended to Hitler and his fellow putschists a fairly comfortable imprisonment. Hitler wore his own clothes, received friendly treatment from guards, enjoyed ample food, and was allowed regular visitors, including admirers who brought flowers and gifts. He was even permitted a private room with a view of the countryside. In effect, Landsberg was more retreat than jail for Hitler, a quiet refuge where he could gather his thoughts. During the 9 months Hitler spent at Landsberg, he entered in April 1924 and was released in December that year. He undertook one of his most important projects, writing his memoir and political manifesto, Mein Kampf, My Struggle. Dictating to a loyal secretary, fellow prisoner Rudolf Hess, and occasionally typing on an old machine, Hitler poured his life story, ideas, and plans onto paper. He wrote of his youth, his days in Vienna, his war experience, but above all, he articulated the ideology that would later become the blueprint for the Nazi regime. In Mein Kampf, Hitler laid out in rambling but passionate prose his belief in the racial superiority of the Aryan people and his intense anti-Semitism, referring to Jews as bacteria corrupting society and asserting that they must be removed. He described democracy as a failed system and advocated a dictatorship led by a single strong leader, Führer, who would embody the will of the people. He argued that Germany needed Lebensraum, living space, to expand, and that this meant conquering territories to the east in Eastern Europe and Russia, which were then populated by what he saw as inferior Slavic peoples. Germany's destiny, Hitler claimed, was to unite all ethnic Germans, overturn the Versailles Treaty, and build a vast new empire. Although Mein Kampf did not spell out exactly how these radical goals would be achieved, its inherent genocidal thrust is undeniable. As historian Ian Kershaw observed, given Hitler's depiction of Jews as a mortal enemy whose extermination would be the only solution, Hitler's time in prison thus became a period of reflection and planning, where in the silence of his cell, he transformed his rage and ideas into a manifesto for future action. Hitler's incarceration ended much sooner than expected. In December 1924, after just about 13 months behind bars, including time before trial, Hitler was pardoned and released by the Bavarian authorities. This early release came against the objections of the state prosecutor, but reflected the political realities. By late 1924, the threat from the Nazi movement seemed to have subsided, and pressure was mounting to show leniency. Walking out of Landsberg prison shortly before Christmas, Hitler was greeted by cheering supporters. He was a free man and a wiser one. The failed putsch had taught him that attempting to seize power by force was premature folly. In Landsberg, he had decided on a new strategy. The Nazis would henceforth seek power through legal means, by winning elections and infiltrating institutions, rather than by outright rebellion. This change of tack was critical. Hitler told his followers that they must hold our noses and enter the Reichstag, parliament, to undermine the system from within, instead of trying to topple it overnight with guns. Throughout 1925, Hitler set about rebuilding the Nazi Party, which had been banned in Bavaria after the putsch. He negotiated with the Bavarian government, promising to respect the law if the ban were lifted. In February 1925, the ban was removed, and Hitler refounded the Nazi Party with himself as its undisputed Führer. There were conditions. For a time, the authorities forbade him from public speaking in Bavaria, a ban that remained in effect until 1927, because his inflammatory rhetoric was considered a public danger. Thus, Hitler operated somewhat behind the scenes in the mid-1922, organizing rather than orating. During this quiet period, he focused on strengthening the party's structure. He appointed capable lieutenants to build Nazi organizations across Germany, men like Gregor Strasser in the north and a young agitator named Joseph Goebbels in the industrial Rhineland. To attract the youth, he established the Hitler Youth Movement, which indoctrinated boys and girls in Nazi ideology from a young age. And to secure absolute loyalty, Hitler created a new elite guard answerable only to him, the Schutzstaffel SS, distinguished by their black uniforms and sworn personally to the Führer. Under the leadership of Heinrich Himmler later on, the SS would grow from a handful of men into a terrifying force of tens of thousands, spearheading the darkest crimes of the regime, but in the 1922, it was still just an idea, is germinating. Hitler also worked to broaden his base beyond the rowdy beer hall crowd. He cultivated relationships with influential figures on the right, aristocratic army officers, wealthy industrialists, and conservative politicians in Berlin. These establishment forces were initially wary of the noisy demagogue, but Hitler's anti-communist, anti-Versailles message appealed to them. By the late 1922, some were willing to provide financial support to the Nazis, or at least tolerate them as a useful counterweight to the left. It was during these years that Hitler befriended the likes of General Erich Ludendorff, though they later fell out, and won the admiration of publisher Alfred Hugenberg, an influential media mogul. Outside of politics, Hitler's personal life in the 1920s was peculiar but worth noting for its quiet moments of emotion. After his release from prison, Hitler often resided at a mountain home in the Bavarian Alps, in a village called Berchtesgaden. There, in the peaceful alpine air, he would relax, take long walks, and play host to a small circle of friends and admirers. It was during this time that Hitler formed a close relationship with his half-niece, Geli Raubal, a vibrant young woman in her early 20s. Geli lived in Hitler's Munich apartment for a while, and Hitler, deeply fond of her, became obsessively protective. Their relationship was likely never physical, but it was emotionally intense. Tragically, in 1931, Geli Raubal died by suicide, shooting herself with Hitler's pistol in his apartment. Hitler was shattered by Geli's death. Neighbors recalled hearing him weeping inconsolably. He later hung her portrait on the wall, calling her the only woman he ever truly loved. In the wake of this loss, Hitler's close companions noticed a cold hardening in him. Not long after, he began a relationship with a quiet young woman named Eva Braun, a shop assistant from Munich. But he kept this liaison very private. For public purposes, especially as he rose to power, Hitler cultivated an image as a celibate man married only to Germany. These human details, muted and behind the scenes, added subtle depth to the otherwise political creature he had become. By the late 1922, the Nazi Party was rebuilt and waiting for an opportunity. That opportunity came in the form of a global catastrophe, the Great Depression. In October 1929, the U.S. stock market crashed, sending shockwaves around the world. Germany's fragile post-war economy crashed too. Banks failed, factories closed, and millions lost their jobs. Angry, desperate people searched for solutions. The democratic government in Berlin seemed paralyzed, offering harsh austerity measures that only deepened misery. In this climate of crisis, Hitler's message began to resonate with a new urgency. He and his propagandists promised to repudiate the Versailles Treaty, to restore German pride, and most tangibly, to get people back to work by rebuilding the nation's military and infrastructure. The Nazis tailored their appeal to different groups. Peasants were told they would get stable crop prices. Middle-class shopkeepers were assured the party would protect them from big department stores and communist upheaval. And unemployed workers heard that under Nazi leadership, the streets would be safe and jobs would return. Hitler traveled up and down Germany by airplane, one of the first politicians to campaign by air, speaking sometimes to 2 or 3 cities in a single day, reaching people who had never seen him before. His 1,932 presidential campaign slogan was Hitler über Deutschland, Hitler over Germany, emphasizing both his aerial barnstorming and his promise to stand above partisan politics. The political tide was turning. In the 1928 elections, the Nazi Party had been a marginal player, winning a mere 2.6% of the national vote. But after the Depression hit, their fortunes skyrocketed. In the Reichstag parliament elections of September 1930, the Nazis shocked the country by winning over 18% of the vote, leaping from 12 seats to 107 seats in the assembly. They became the second largest party in Germany. 2 years later, in July 1932, the Nazis topped that, securing 37% of the vote and 230 seats, making them the largest party in the Reichstag. Although they still did not have an outright majority, Hitler's movement had gone from fringe to mainstream in just a few years. The streets of German towns now echoed with the tramp of Nazi brown-shirted SA men parading, singing martial songs. Posters with Hitler's fierce visage and the swastika emblem were plastered on walls everywhere. To many ordinary Germans worn down by economic despair, Hitler's fiery rallies and promises of national revival brought hope. To others, he was a frightening figure, heralding chaos. But even many of these people underestimated him, thinking the Austrian corporal would fade away or be controlled by more respectable conservatives. They were soon to be proven wrong.